Dear Professor Roberto, I'm very happy to have you again. And we were both busy during spring, and hopefully we're going to have more time in summer. This time we're going to talk about the Festival of Prophet Moses, or Nabi Musa.
Yep. And thank you for inviting me again.
I'm going to invite you 20 times if we have 20 different themes to discuss about, and I'm sure we have lots of common intellectual interests and lots of professional interests that are related to this region. And one of them is also the festival of Prophet Moses. Prophet Moses is buried, supposedly buried on multiple occasions. One of them is Mount Nebo, where is a famous Franciscan monastery. Another one is close to Jericho. How can we define the festival of Prophet Moses? Because in the past, it gathered Jews, Christians, and Muslims.
So this is a fascinating story. And I just want to highlight the fact that recently a good friend of mine and good colleague, Professor Awad Alabi, published a great book about the Nabi Musa festival and its history. He has unpacked also questions about its origins and also some sort of an anthropological historical study of the participants and how to understand, as you said, that obviously there are multiple locations that are connected with the Prophet Moses, and the festival that occurred in Jerusalem since the 14th century was very much once established by Saladin when he took over the Holy Land and Palestine as a sort of a counterbalance with local Jewish and Christian pilgrimage towards the city. So the festival was located in the calendar very close to both the Jewish Passover and the Christian Easter, both the Greek Orthodox and the Catholic. So it was a calculated choice to add to the already packed religious calendar of the Holy City another festival that would have changed the demographic balance, the pilgrimage. And this festival started, and it's from Palestine, so the Mamluks, obviously the Ottomans, and still functioned under the British, and then eventually came to an end as the festival was becoming a very politicized moment in Palestine, and particularly in Jerusalem. And so ever since there is a memory of it, there are small processions that have been taking place in the past 70 years since the creation of the State of Israel, and also under Jordanian Jerusalem, where partly the festival was revived, but essentially the celebrations of the festival as it was known before ended more or less with the establishment of a mandate and sort of the following decades that led to the creation of a state and the current conflict. Now, what is very important to remember is that it is an Islamic festival, but all the sources available speak about a co-participations of other communities. And I think this is an important aspect. So essentially, it was understood that this was sort of a new tradition, a festival that had been artificially created. And in time, the communities of Jerusalem began to attend the festival, which was led by obviously a number of Muslim families, both within Jerusalem, but also important families, so notables in Arabic, ayan, from nearby cities who would eventually converge into first Jerusalem, and then a final procession towards Nabi Musa, which is, as you mentioned earlier, in between Jerusalem and Jericho, but essentially very close to Jericho in terms of physical distance. And so in time, it had become a sort of one of those festivals that helped historians to understand internal dynamics within the city. Obviously, Nabi Musa was not the only one that saw the population of Jerusalem, particularly under the Ottomans, mostly in the 18th, 19th century, where we have more sources available. And we can see that communities attended each other's religious events. Perhaps not all of them, but certainly there was some sort of a again, co-participation. So we know through diaries and memoirs that Christian and Muslims would have attended some Jewish parties, particularly Purim or even Passover, and serve. We know that it's still taking place up to a point where, with the end of a Passover, you would see Muslims giving away sweets to Jews, leavened sweets, because that marks the end of a Passover. We do obviously have Muslims attending Christian celebrations. Not many Jews would have attended those because the Christians had some sort of barriers or religious barriers that would have forbidden the Jews to either attend or physically visit, for instance, a church. But yet other less religious parties would have been attended by all communities. And similarly, you have Islamic festivals that were co-participated by Christian and Jews, or we also have examples where Christian and Jews would have provided, help or even attended iftar or certainly ceremonies during Ramadan. So it speaks about this kind of participated coexistence, which certainly existed throughout the Ottoman Middle East, but it was much more visible in places like Jerusalem, where obviously you also have a more relative proximity to holy places. So I think we should understand the Nabi Musa festival in this larger context of, just a festival that is part of a longer calendar of other festivities. But that doesn't necessarily mean, again, that, these were always quiet and happy celebrations. As it happened in 1920, it happened also before 1920. Occasions like the Nabi Musa festivals were used to send political messages, either towards the rulers of the Ottomans, but also to other communities. So obviously, it was some sort of a thermometer, a barometer that would give us a sense of the state of relationship between local communities, the central powers, and within local communities.
What was the relation between local communities and the Ottoman authorities in 19th century, before the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in 1922? I'm talking about the period of Tanzimat.
Well, first of all, we have to remember that Palestine had been ruled for about 10 years by the so-called Egyptian dynasty. So
Yeah.
Mohammed or Mehmet Ali, since he was an Albanian, probably is better to use the Mehmet Ali name. And Ibrahim Pasha, his son, came to rule Palestine between 1831 and 1840, which was a major shift in sort of the administrative and also in religious terms. It was a major shift in the ways in which Palestine was organized. So we have changes in the local administrations, but also changes in the ways in which local religious authorities related to the central power, which now was obviously based in Egypt. But that eventually continued also after the Ottomans came to regain control over Palestine and Jerusalem in 1840, mostly with the help of Western powers. Now, obviously, that's the moment we also have the enforcement of the Tanzimat reforms, which were, again, accepted, but we also have to remember that there were, both families that either lost some power or they were threatened in their power ruling over the local populations. Besides, with the Tanzimat era, we also have sort of the major change, which was to make all subjects equal in front of the law, regardless of their religious so the different religious communities. Not the same end, for instance, that we have seen in Lebanon or Syria. We should remember the sort of the massacres against the Christians that occurred in Damascus in 1860, which certainly stemmed from all of these changes. We don't have the same degree of either violence or rebellions against the Ottomans in Palestine. So in the various provinces that now we call Palestine and Jerusalem. And I think one of the most important things is that Palestinian leaders, again, mostly Muslims, Christians, and also some very important Jewish families, understood the value of a balance and also the presence of fairly well-trained governors sent by Istanbul, and a good presence of foreigners, various nationalities, kind of help to keep that balance work. And one of my arguments in my work is that that balance was delicate, but it was functional. And it's only when the British arrived that that delicate balance was messed up and eventually collapsed. But essentially, you have different elements at play that allowed for these reforms to go through and eventually to be digested by the local population. I think one of the most important reforms, however, that occurred, it has to do with land reform. So as a spin-off of the Tanzimat reforms, which reformed the administrative uh, framework of the Ottoman Empire and also, again, the legal one. But for Palestine, one of the most important reforms is the 1856, I would say, if I remember well, with changes also later of a land sort of ownership, which kind of allowed for more people to purchase land. So, Waqf remained Waqf, obviously designated land for, religious endowments, whether Muslim, Christian, or Jewish. But then the fact that new categories were introduced, miri land, mulk. So the whole idea that land could now be part of a commercial transaction became a game changer. First of all, we know that the Greek Orthodox Church, which was one of the most important landowners in Palestine, began to sell land first to local Arab wealthy owners and landowners. But more importantly, with the arrival of Zionists in Palestine, we see that land change hands thanks to this code, which, land that was legally purchased by Zionists. And we saw that with the first settlements, like Tikva or Rishon LeZion. Essentially, these are all settlements built on land that was legally purchased following these reforms. So, if anything else, sometimes it's important to also look at not just the Tanzimat era and the following reforms through an administrative point of view, which is important. We have the creation of municipalities, which to an extent already existed, certainly in Jerusalem. The reformation of the provinces, the creation of local councils. So certainly we have major changes. But in my view, one of the most important changes occurred within the land code, which allowed for more transactions to take place.
What happened in 1920? Because we had the big demonstrations and violence at the Nabi Musa festival.
Nabi Musa festival 1920, in my view, was because now more historians are considering it as part of already this emerging national conflict between Palestinians and Zionists. And I think the reason why for a long time the Nabi Musa riots were considered not as relevant as, for instance, the incidents in Jaffa in 1921 or obviously the 1929 massacres, named after the Wailing Wall riots, but essentially that were not just based in Jerusalem. I think it's mostly because we're connected with this idea of rioting and connected to a religious festival. And so historians in the past just define these as some sort of a religious extremism where two parties were trying to use violence against each other. But a thorough analysis of the material available really shows that this was just a trigger. So what happened in April 1920 is that, again, we have the usual tradition for Muslims to celebrate the Prophet Moses, and that it's happening within the usual context of, in this case now, the British, since they took over after the end of World War I, sort of, allowing for the festival to take place, also providing some security and safety. What's happening, obviously, is that we have the introduction of a new actor, which is the Zionist, and also the introduction of a new form of politics, which is nationalism on the Palestinian side. And so what happened in 1920s is that you have various new ingredients that are coming together, and instead of producing the usual religious festival, they produce something different. And it started as a religious festival with pilgrimages that are coming from the different parts of Palestine, from Hebron, from Jericho and other Palestinian cities with a purpose to converge into the city of Jerusalem and then eventually move to Jericho as it was the usual tradition of a festival. What we see in 1920 is that we have an earlier politicization of the festival. So we have political leaders who are calling for the use of a political language during the festival. So no longer we have just the banners celebrating obviously Prophet Muhammad, but also Prophet Moses. But we see also the introduction of banners that were used for political purposes to sort of foster a Palestinian identity and to foster a local form of nationalism. And at the same time, you have the Zionist forces, mostly led by Vladimir Jabotinsky, so a right-wing movement which already was forming a militia, taking the streets of Jerusalem and waiting to see, how events would unfold. Now, there's always been a lot of attention to the trigger. Were the Zionists spitting on the banners? Were the Arabs attacking the Zionists? Honestly, it doesn't really matter. I mean, that's a trigger. My argument is that, there was a potential ready for violence, and both sides were eager to show each other strength. So obviously, the first day of the pilgrimage was fairly quiet, and then the second day, which I think was a Sunday, April 4th, we have processions moving into the city. And what is interesting, and again, you see the differences here, is that instead of going into the old city towards the Dome of the Rock, Palestinians decided to move the processions outside the old city and going into the old city through Jaffa Gate. Jaffa Gate was generally understood as a secular place for gatherings, and therefore it showed how the leaders of a festival were trying to give a political brand to the festival itself. And this is where we have speeches that were given, traditionally speeches where would have been religious in nature, but this time we have, against the usual protocol, speeches that are for the most part against Zionism. We have, reports by famous journalists, nationalist leader. One of them, Aref al-Aref, was later one of the most important nationalist leaders in Palestine. By then, was the editor of Al-Suriyya Al-Janubiyya, so this newspaper, southern Syria. And, essentially already in the paper before the festival, he was arguing, well, if we don't use force against the Jews intended as Zionists, we will never be rid of them. And others, the same was repeated during the festivals. And so the crowd often chanted newly imported anti-Semitic, chants like we will drink the blood of the Jews, or similar kind of rhetoric was used. And what is interesting is that there's also the use of pictures of Faisal, that by then Faisal was, the short-lived king of Syria up until the French came and ousted him. And so you can see how, there's a lot of politics. There's also religious feelings that are used for political purposes, which were never used before, for instance. And obviously that created a very tense situations outside Jaffa Gate. And at the same time, you have all of these Zionist militia mingling with the local population, listening to the speeches. And it's possible that some of these Zionists decided to react to the speeches themselves. Now, as I said, it's irrelevant what happened in terms of trigger. But what is important is that obviously we have the outbreak of violence, which many can see as a form of riot. But my argument is that actually that violence was partly organized. It's not random. We have shops that were looted, spectators that were beaten. We have mostly Zionists carrying weapons. Some of them were used. Obviously, there's no one final target other than showing each other's strength. So yes, it feels like a riot where we have random violence, But at the same time, you have individuals who are organized and they know exactly what they're doing. We also have a case of rape. A few young Jewish girls were raped. Eventually, the perpetrators were found. And that's another interesting story because one of them was a Christian and a Catholic. And that's where I found some documents about this individual. And, we also have the intervention of the police, the British police, which by then was absent. Lots of accusations were thrown against the governor of Jerusalem, Ronald Storrs, who probably misread the signs, or he was convinced that the police that was sent would have been able to do the job, and eventually were not enough police officers on the ground. Eventually, with the end of the first day, and the following days, violence was limited. The casualties amounted to 251, and 9 people died, and eventually 22 were critically wounded. So we have 5 Jews that died, 4 Muslims, and we have about 211 Jews that were wounded, and only 21 Muslims and 3 Christians. What is interesting is that there's only 7 British soldiers that reported injuries, which also tells us that the police were not the target. This was an affair, a business between the Palestinian nationalists and the Zionists. And, it's important because, again, it shows the sort of ideas that were entrenched into both groups. This, in my view, was the first time semi-organized groups were meeting with, imbued of political ideas and ready to use violence as a form of political language. So I don't see violence here as violence per se, but it's a semantic tool just to tell the other, show the other the strength that we're made of. And so, eventually, the Nabi Musa riots became this moment, which also triggered a number of changes. So first of all, we see that the British understood that the military administration had to be changed. So right after the events in the summer of 1920, the military administration of Jerusalem was dismantled and became a civilian one. Ronald Storrs remained the governor, but now was no longer the military governor, was the civilian governor. But it's also interesting how it was portrayed. So Jews, mostly the Zionists, refer to this event as a pogrom.
Yeah.
Which I had issues with. I mean, this was not a pogrom in terms.
Of course, they
but it became part of a narrative.
Type of narrative from Eastern Europe. Because
yes, exactly.
Like Vladimir Jabotinsky were not autochthonous Jews who lived in Palestine and mingled with local Christians and Muslims, but they were part of colonial settlers.
Yeah, exactly. And I would say, unfortunately, from an historical perspective, this idea that the 1920 Nabi Musa riots were a pogrom have remained as a definition for decades, particularly in traditional Zionist historiography. And even recently, I was reading a few books that reported these events, and they were simply defined as an early example of pogrom. It's not only historically wrong, but it also doesn't really take into account the events, but also what they really meant for the Zionists. I mean, the one thing that Jabotinsky understood was that numbers were important. Obviously, Jews are still a minority. Remember that Jabotinsky eventually was exiled by the British. But it's important to understand how he understood these events, and for him, obviously numbers, but also the necessity to be armed in order to counter the fact that, Jews were still a minority, demographically speaking. So there's a lot of lessons that have been learned. And that's why, this is not just a pogrom driven by anti-Semitism, but it's more than that. It is also important to understand what happened on the Palestinian side. I mean, obviously, violence and organized violence became a more available tool, something that so if not to use it, the threat of it. Obviously, this is an important element, and we see, documents, by Palestinian political leaders. We saw, particularly through the work of Muslim Christian associations that were formed at that period of time, how violence was used as a threat. Many times these associations writing to the British, they would remind, look, we are the majority. We don't want to use violence, but if we need to, we can. And I think this, again, was an idea of showing their strength, at least the numeric strength. It doesn't necessarily mean that we're ready to use it. In fact, I think it's important to highlight the point that we tend to look at, this period of time and the history of Palestine and Israel, Palestine and, relations with Jews and Zionists as inherently violent. But as a very good friend and scholar, Hillel Cohen always says, we need to start looking at the periods in between. And, you have incidents in 1920, but the next big incidents are in 1929. So how did people cope in that period of time? How did people live? How things changed? And this is very important to show that there is a threat of violence, but it's not constantly violent, historical development in terms of the relationship between these groups. And so it's important to understand that, there are all windows of opportunities and possibilities in between. And it's the agency of people, of individuals, particularly of leaders, that eventually make the possibility of using violence a reality. It would be too simplistic and too easy just to say, oh, there's always violence. Actually, we have less episodes of violence than, periods of relatively calm and peace when we look at the long durée, the long history of the past century or so. And I think, again, the Nabi Musa riots are this kind of a watershed from previous examples of intercommunal violence, which existed in Jerusalem and in Palestine, even though, as I always argued, actually, particularly in Palestine and in Jerusalem, we always had more intracommunal violence. Essentially, there's always been more violent encounters between members of the same religion, perhaps divided by denomination. So when you look at examples of violence in Jerusalem, most of the examples we have are coming from within Christian denominations. Greek Orthodox killing Catholic monks, Catholic monks and clergy, taking revenge against the Greek Orthodox. This is the kind of pattern that we see. Obviously, we have incidents. I remember reading documents about a young Jewish girl stealing some food from a Muslim shop owner, and that triggered the intervention of the communities. But eventually it was solved. So obviously we have moments of tensions. But in general, again, the dynamics within the city and within the various religious groups prevented the outbreak of major violence, as we've seen in Lebanon or in Syria, for instance. The arrival of the British, the arrival of the Zionists, the formation of a parallel government within Palestine under the British, the Zionist Commission, then to become the Jewish Agency under the mandate, they all fostered the use of violence. But this time, in an organized form and in a semantic way. So violence had meanings, was not used just for the sake of violence, even though, as we see in 1929, obviously, we really have the brutal use of violence by both sides with terrible killings and violence perpetrated against each other. But yet, it was very much a political form of language. It was about showing their power, their strength, showing the other what they were capable of. So it was very much the idea of sending messages rather than committing violence for the sake of violence.
What's going on with the Nabi Musa festival in recent decades after 1995 and after Second Intifada? Because between 1997 and 2000, Nabi Musa festival took place, but with the outbreak of Second Intifada in 2000, it was banned for 7 years, and it again revived in 2007.
Yeah, I mean, what is important is that after the So first of all, between 1948 and 67, so under the Jordanians, the festival was authorized once again. And even between 67 and 1987, so under the first 2 decades of Israeli occupation of the West Bank and East Jerusalem, the festival continued, albeit under more strict control. But essentially, as you mentioned, with the outbreak of the First Intifada, it was prohibited and then eventually kind of restarted. During the Oslo Accords, there was an idea with a newly created Palestinian Authority to reorganize the pilgrimage, but eventually the festivities were not taking place in Jerusalem, but only at the location of the Nabi Musa festival, of the Nabi Musa. So we do have an attempt to revive it, but again, given the political circumstances, essentially Israel had banned the festival since 2000. It was renewed in 2007 and again banned. We also had very interesting phenomenon occurring where young Palestinians would use the Nabi Musa location for rave parties, and that happened only a few years ago, which to me meant that a local sort of a loss of control over the place and possibly also over the meaning of a festival. But I think there's still potential to revive a festival itself. And again, nowadays is considered almost a Jericho kind of festival because obviously the location is connected to Jerusalem. But the possibility to revive it could be again possible in a future that might allow Palestinians to repossess not only the festival, but the possibility to reconstitute the festival and express their religious, attachment to the prophet, through a series of pilgrimages. But obviously, at the moment, it's just practically impossible. Not only to perform that festival, but even to foresee when and that tradition can be revived, and if can be revived.
Thank you so much for today's presentation about Nabi Musa Festival. If you want to add something in the last 4 minutes, please go ahead.
No, I just want to say that again, the Nabi Musa Festival, they have to be understood in this larger new context of a post-war Palestine and Jerusalem. And I think it's important also to connect the riots and expression and use of violence also with the clear and emerging pattern of the British administration that was changing Jerusalem. With the arrival of Ronald Storrs as governor, he himself had plans and ideas how to change, reshape the urban framework and layout of Jerusalem. And that has to be considered as part of this, emergence of local violence. Because again, once you change certain features of a city like Jerusalem, obviously there will be repercussions. The whole idea of naming streets, which had already been named under the Ottomans, but to name the streets according to British criteria, to number the streets, it obviously implies a form of control. The very fact that the British was fostering the creation of new neighborhoods with a majority of Jewish residents in the city that was changing the urban demographic of the city. Again, that has to be considered part of this sort of use of threat by the Arabs versus the Zionists. Once they felt threatened themselves in their sort of demographic within the city of Jerusalem. So it's important also to connect and understand the riots within also the impending creation of mandatory Palestine and the transformation which Palestine and Jerusalem underwent through the British administration.
Thank you so much. we'll keep in touch and we're going to continue our conversation.
Thank you so much for your invitation, and it was a pleasure to talk about the Nabi Musa rights.
Thank you, Professor Mazza. All the best.
Thank you.